If you walked through the streets of Paris in 1380 wearing a surcoat with sides cut so low they were nicknamed the windows to hell, you weren't just making a fashion statement, you were practically inviting a public exorcism. The medieval world wasn't a drab, brown landscape of potato sacks and dirt. It was a high-stakes battlefield of velvet, silk, and hats, so tall they required structural engineering just to keep your neck from snapping. Most of what you've seen in Hollywood, the corsets, the loose hair, the peasant rags, is a complete lie. Today, we are burning the costume department's myths to the ground. We are ranking a millennium of style, from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, into a definitive no-holds-barred tier list. As a medieval historian, I'm evaluating these garments based on the 3 pillars of survival and status: comfort, practicality, and pure, unadulterated style. By the end of this, you'll understand why the 14th century was the undisputed peak of human aesthetics, why the 15th century went absolutely off the rails with its footwear, and which specific garment on this list was so controversial it actually led to legal crackdowns by the church. Take a look at the hennin. You call it the princess hat. I call it a logistical nightmare that makes doorways your greatest enemy. Is it an S-tier icon of majesty or a D-tier disaster that belongs in the trash heap of history? And then there's the chemise, the medieval equivalent of streetwear, that everyone wore but no one talked about. If you think your favorite period drama got the look right, prepare to be disappointed. We're diving into the structural secrets of the houppelande, a garment so heavy it could double as a weighted blanket, and the cote-hardie, which essentially invented the concept of looking hot in the Middle Ages. We have a massive spread on the table today: the bourrelet, the German gown, the tabard, and even nuns' habits. Some of these provided the ultimate freedom of movement, while others were literal instruments of torture designed to signal that you were too rich to ever have to do anything useful. We're asking the hard questions. Could you survive a winter in the English countryside wearing only an underdress? Why were false sleeves the ultimate 15th century flex? And which of these outfits would actually get you laughed out of a medieval tavern? The stakes are higher than just looking good. In the Middle Ages, what you wore told the world exactly who you were, who you served, and how much money you had to burn. One garment on this list is so versatile it stayed in fashion for nearly 500 years, while another was a flash-in-the-pan trend that made everyone look like they were wearing a stuffed donut on their heads. One of these is a god-tier masterpiece of tailoring that we should honestly bring back into modern rotation, and another is a historical fail so profound it's a miracle the wearer didn't trip and die immediately. Before we place the first item on the board, ask yourself, if you were transported back to the year 1350 right now, would you be dressed for a coronation or a catastrophe? Most of you are currently imagining a world of drab tunics, but I'm about to show you a world of vibrant dyes, scandalous hemlines, and headgear that defied the laws of gravity. We're starting with the heavy hitters. We're looking for the elite, the S-tier, the garments that defined an era and still influence high fashion today. But we're also digging through the D-tier, the impractical, the ugly, and the historically inaccurate nonsense that gives medieval history a bad name. Which garment is going to take the top spot? Is it the regal, sweeping lines of the 14th century surcoat, or the humble, hard-working peasant head covering that actually kept society functioning? The answers aren't what you think. The princess aesthetic is about to get a reality check, and the scandalous history of medieval underwear is finally coming to light. Let's see which of these looks survives the scrutiny of the archives and which ones are destined for the historical fail pile. The ranking begins now. When you think of the Middle Ages, what is the first image that flashes across your mind? Is it a knight in shining armor, a peasant covered in grime? Or perhaps, most iconically, a princess wearing one of those tall conical hats, leaning out of a stone window? For most of us, our perception of medieval fashion has been filtered through 1,000 years of fairy tales, Hollywood blockbusters, and low-budget Renaissance fairs. We've been taught to see the Middle Ages as a monolith, a 1,000-year-long blur of drab tunics and itchy wool. But the reality is far more vibrant, far more complex, and frankly, far more scandalous than you've been led to believe. I'm Dr. Eleanor Janega, and I spend my life looking into the dirty, beautiful, and often bizarre corners of the medieval world. One of the questions I get asked most often is, what did women actually wear? And the answer isn't just one outfit. It's an evolving landscape of status symbols, religious mandates, and bold experiments in silhouette. We are talking about an era that saw the invention of the button, which was basically the high-tech revolution of the 14th century, and the rise of sideless dresses that moralists at the time literally called the windows to hell. Today, we are going to settle the score once and for all. We aren't just looking at these clothes. We are ranking them. We're taking everything from the humble peasant's hair covering to the gravity-defying headwear of the Burgundian court and putting them through the gauntlet. Welcome to the definitive medieval women's fashion tier list. Before we dive into the racks, let's establish the rules of the game. To rank these garments fairly, we can't just look at them through a 21st century lens. We have to evaluate them based on the criteria that actually mattered to a woman living in the year 1350 or 1420. Our ranking system today is built on 3 pillars: comfort, practicality, and style. First, comfort. Was this garment a soft linen dream that felt like a hug, or was it a structural nightmare held together by pins that poked you every time you moved? Second, practicality. Could you actually do anything in this? If you're a noble woman, can you walk across a room without tripping over 5 feet of excess silk? If you're a laborer, does it protect you from the elements, or is it just in the way? And finally, style, the vogue factor. Did this outfit tell the world you were the wealthiest, most influential woman in the room? Or did it scream that you were 3 decades behind the current trends? We'll be moving through a massive range of history, roughly from the 5th century all the way to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th century. We'll be looking at the staples of the wardrobe, the items every woman owned, like the chemise, and the high-fashion outliers that were reserved for the top 1%. We'll discuss the houppelande, the ultimate, look at how much fabric I can afford flex, and the cotehardy, the garment that finally gave women a shape. We'll even tackle the footwear and the headgear, because in the Middle Ages, your hat wasn't just a hat. It was a statement of your entire social identity. In our S tier, we're looking for the absolute icons, the garments that balanced form and function so perfectly they defined an age. These are the pieces that were so good. They've stayed in our collective consciousness for centuries. In the A and B tiers, we have the solid, reliable classics, the workhorses of the medieval wardrobe that looked great and got the job done. C tier is for the meh moments, the outfits that were fine, I guess, but lacked that certain medieval je ne sais quoi. And then there is the D tier, the disasters. These are the historical fails The garments that were either so impractical they were dangerous or so aesthetically questionable that even 12th century monks felt the need to write angry letters about them. There's a common myth that medieval people didn't care about how they looked, or that they were all suppressed by a dour, colorless church. Let me tell you right now, that is absolute nonsense. Medieval women were obsessed with fashion. They cheated on sumptuary laws that told them what fabrics they weren't allowed to wear. They plucked their hairlines to achieve the perfect, high forehead. They padded their hips and experimented with dyes made from crushed insects and fermented plants to get the perfect shade of scarlet. They were just as vain, just as creative, and just as daring as any modern fashionista. So, whether you're a costume designer looking for historical accuracy, a history buff who wants to know what life was really like on the ground, or someone who just wants to know if you could actually sit down in a 15th century court gown, you're in the right place. We're going to strip away the Hollywood filters and look at the real wool, the real silk, and the real linen of the Middle Ages. Which pieces will rise to the top as S-tier masterpieces? Which ones are destined for the scrap heap of the D-tier? And where will your favorite princess outfit land? It's time to get into the weeds of historical tailoring. Grab your pins and your shears, because we are heading into the wardrobes of the past to find out what was truly hot and what was a total historical flop. Let's start ranking. To understand the gravity of these rankings, we first have to dismantle the single biggest lie Hollywood has ever told you. The idea that medieval people were dirty, dressed in rags, and fundamentally uninterested in their appearance. We've been conditioned to believe that until the Renaissance magically turned the lights on, everyone was just stumbling around in potato sacks tied with twine. That is, quite frankly, historical malpractice. If you were a woman in the 14th century, your clothing wasn't just a look, it was your social security number, your bank statement, and your moral compass all stitched into one. We are talking about a society where fabric was the single most expensive thing most people owned. A high-quality wool gown could cost more than a small house. If you were mugged in a medieval alleyway, they didn't want your coins. They wanted your sleeves. They would literally strip you in the street because the resale value on a well-dyed piece of kirtle was astronomical. But before we can get to the S-tier showstoppers, we have to talk about the foundation. We have to talk about the chemise. In every single movie about the Middle Ages, you see women lounging around in their underdresses, looking like they're in a Victorian nightgown. Wrong. The chemise, or the smock, or the shift was the absolute workhorse of the medieval world. It was almost always made of linen, and its job was simple. Be the barrier between your sweaty, oily human body and your incredibly expensive wool or silk outer garments. Linen is the unsung hero of history. It's breathable, it's durable, and most importantly, it's washable. You didn't wash your velvet surcoat, you'd ruin it. You washed your chemise. This is the secret to why medieval people didn't actually smell like a dumpster fire. They had a rotating system of linen undergarments that wicked away moisture. If we're ranking based on practicality, the chemise is pushing for a high spot simply because it kept the entire population from dying of skin infections. But in terms of style, it's a white rectangle. It's the 14th century equivalent of a Hanes white t-shirt. Essential? Yes. A fashion statement? Only if you're trying to tell the world you've given up on life and are heading straight for a nunnery. Now let's talk about the pain of the 14th century, the tailoring revolution. For hundreds of years, fashion was big circles and rectangles. You took a piece of fabric, You cut a hole for your head, and you belted it. It was loose, it was flowy, and it was, to be honest, a bit boring. But right around the 1340s, something explosive happened. Someone, somewhere, figured out how to use curved seams and buttons. Suddenly, clothes started to actually fit the human body, and this is where the trouble started. This transition is why we see the rise of the cotehardy. This is the garment that redefined the female silhouette. It was tight-fitting through the torso, flared at the hips, and usually featured a row of buttons down the front so long it would make a modern tailor weep. For the first time in centuries, you could see that a woman had a waist. You could see the shape of her bust. You could see her arms. The church, as you can imagine, absolutely lost its mind. Preachers began screaming from pulpits that these new, tight-fitting garments were the devil's snares. They argued that by showing the shape of the body, women were essentially inviting men to go straight to hell without passing go. This brings us to the windows to hell, the sideless surcoat. Imagine a dress where the sides have been scooped out from the shoulder all the way down to the hip, revealing the fitted kirtle underneath. To us, it looks like a chic layering choice. To a medieval monk, it was a literal portal to damnation. They called them the devil's peepholes. And this is the mystery we have to solve today. Why did women keep wearing them? If the most powerful institution on earth, the Catholic Church, is telling you that your dress is a one-way ticket to eternal fire, why are you still commissioning your tailor to cut the armholes even deeper? The answer lies in the high-stakes game of status. In the Middle Ages, looking modest was a requirement, but looking rich was a necessity. If you could afford the extra fabric of a trailing hem, the expensive dyes of a deep crimson, and the specialized labor of a tailor who knew how to fit a sleeve so tightly you had to be sewn into it every morning, you weren't just a woman, you were a goddess. But here is where we have to address the historical fail that haunts every Renaissance fair: the corset. If I see one more medieval movie where a woman is being pulled into a metal-boned corset in the year 1200, I am going to throw my copy of the Canterbury Tales at the screen. People love the suffering for fashion narrative. They love the idea that women were oppressed by their clothes. But the reality is far more interesting. Medieval women didn't use whalebone or steel to get that silhouette. They used tailoring. They used layers of stiffened linen and the tension of the fabric itself. They were remarkably mobile. They could ride horses, they could run businesses, and they could dance for 6 hours straight. The pain wasn't in the wearing. The pain was in the sumptuary laws. These were actual legal statutes passed by kings to stop people from dressing above their station. If you were a merchant's daughter and you showed up in a fur-lined hood or a certain shade of purple, you could be fined, imprisoned, or have the clothes literally stripped off your back. Fashion was a battlefield because it was the only way to tell who was winning the class war. So, as we prepare to put the first item on the board, remember, we aren't just looking at pretty dresses. We are looking at a world where a hat could get you excommunicated, where a pair of shoes could make you a social pariah, and where the way you pinned your veil determined whether you were a virtuous wife or a woman of ill repute. We've talked about the windows to hell. We've talked about the linen revolution. We've established that Hollywood has lied to you about the grime and the corsets. You're probably sitting there thinking, okay, so the 14th century was the peak of tailoring and the chemise was the hero of hygiene. I get it. It's all about looking rich and staying clean. But here is the thing. While the noblewomen were busy being sewn into their silk cotehardies and worrying about the length of their trains, The most influential fashion trend of the entire Middle Ages, the one garment that actually changed the course of human history and dictated the global economy for 300 years, wasn't worn by a queen. It wasn't made of silk, and it didn't have a single button on it. In fact, it's a garment that most of you would currently rank as F-tier trash. And yet, without it, the Renaissance literally could not have happened. To understand the gravity of these rankings, we first have to dismantle the single biggest lie Hollywood has ever told you: the idea that medieval people were dirty, dressed in rags, and fundamentally uninterested in their appearance. We've been conditioned to believe that until the Renaissance magically turned the lights on, everyone was just stumbling around in potato sacks tied with twine. That is, quite frankly, historical malpractice. If you were a woman in the 14th century, your clothing wasn't just a look. It was your social security number, your bank statement, and your moral compass all stitched into one. We are talking about a society where fabric was the single most expensive thing most people owned. A high-quality wool gown could cost more than a small house. If you were mugged in a medieval alleyway, they didn't want your coins. They wanted your sleeves. They would literally strip you in the street because the resale value on a well-dyed piece of kirtle was astronomical. But before we can get to the S-tier showstoppers, we have to talk about the foundation. We have to talk about the chemise. In every single movie about the Middle Ages, you see women lounging around in their underdresses, looking like they're in a Victorian nightgown. Wrong. The chemise or the smock or the shift was the absolute workhorse of the medieval world. It was almost always made of linen, and its job was simple: be the barrier between your sweaty, oily human body and your incredibly expensive wool or silk outer garments. Linen is the unsung hero of history. It's breathable, it's durable, and most importantly, it's washable. You didn't wash your velvet surcoat, you'd ruin it. You washed your chemise. This is the secret to why medieval people didn't actually smell like a dumpster fire. They had a rotating system of linen undergarments that wicked away moisture. If we're ranking based on practicality, the chemise is pushing for a high spot simply because it kept the entire population from dying of skin infections. But in terms of style, it's a white rectangle. It's the 14th century equivalent of a Hanes white t-shirt. Essential? Yes. A fashion statement? Only if you're trying to tell the world you've given up on life and are heading straight for a nunnery. Now, let's talk about the pain of the 14th century, the tailoring revolution. For hundreds of years, fashion was big circles and rectangles. You took a piece of fabric, you cut a hole for your head, and you belted it. It was loose, it was flowy, and it was, to be honest, a bit boring. But right around the 1340s, something explosive happened. Someone, somewhere, figured out how to use curved seams and buttons. Suddenly, clothes started to actually fit the human body. And this is where the trouble started. This transition is why we see the rise of the cotehardie. This is the garment that redefined the female silhouette. It was tight-fitting through the torso, flared at the hips, and usually featured a row of buttons down the front, so long it would make a modern tailor weep. For the first time in centuries, you could see that a woman had a waist. You could see the shape of her bust. You could see her arms. The church, as you can imagine, absolutely lost its mind. Preachers began screaming from pulpits that these new, tight-fitting garments were the devil's snares. They argued that by showing the shape of the body, women were essentially inviting men to go straight to hell without passing go. This brings us to the windows to hell, the sideless surcoat. Imagine a dress where the sides have been scooped out from the shoulder all the way down to the hip, revealing the fitted kirtle underneath. To us, it looks like a chic layering choice. To a medieval monk, it was a literal portal to damnation. They called them the devil's peepholes. And this is the mystery we have to solve today. Why did women keep wearing them? If the most powerful institution on earth, the Catholic Church, is telling you that your dress is a one-way ticket to eternal fire, why are you still commissioning your tailor to cut the armholes even deeper? The answer lies in the high-stakes game of status. In the Middle Ages, looking modest was a requirement, but looking rich was a necessity. If you could afford the extra fabric of a trailing hem, the expensive dyes of a deep crimson, and the specialized labor of a tailor who knew how to fit a sleeve so tightly, you had to be sewn into it every morning. You weren't just a woman, you were a goddess. But here is where we have to address the historical fail that haunts every Renaissance fair, the corset. If I see one more medieval movie where a woman is being pulled into a metal-boned corset in the year 1200, I am going to throw my copy of the Canterbury Tales at the screen. People love the suffering for fashion narrative. They love the idea that women were oppressed by their clothes. But the reality is far more interesting. Medieval women didn't use whalebone or steel to get that silhouette. They used tailoring. They used layers of stiffened linen and the tension of the fabric itself. They were remarkably mobile. They could ride horses, they could run businesses, and they could dance for 6 hours straight. The pain wasn't in the wearing. The pain was in the sumptuary laws. These were actual legal statutes passed by kings to stop people from dressing above their station. If you were a merchant's daughter and you showed up in a fur-lined hood or a certain shade of purple, you could be fined, imprisoned, or have the clothes literally stripped off your back. Fashion was a battlefield because it was the only way to tell who was winning the class war. So, as we prepare to put the first item on the board, remember, we aren't just looking at pretty dresses. We are looking at a world where a hat could get you excommunicated, where a pair of shoes could make you a social pariah, and where the way you pinned your veil determined whether you were a virtuous wife or a woman of ill repute. We've talked about the windows to hell. We've talked about the linen revolution. We've established that Hollywood has lied to you about the grime and the corsets. You're probably sitting there thinking, okay, so the 14th century was the peak of tailoring and the chemise was the hero of hygiene. I get it. It's all about looking rich and staying clean. But here's the thing. While the noblewomen were busy being sewn into their silk coat-hardies and worrying about the length of their trains, the most influential fashion trend of the entire Middle Ages, the one garment that actually changed the course of human history and dictated the global economy for 300 years, wasn't worn by a queen. It wasn't made of silk, and it didn't have a single button on it. In fact, it's a garment that most of you would currently rank as F-tier trash. And yet, without it, the Renaissance literally could not have happened. Let's talk about the humble veil and wimple. To the modern eye, the wimple is the ultimate symbol of female oppression. You see it and you think of nuns, or you think of women being forced to hide their beauty under layers of heavy white fabric. You see a woman muffled to the chin and think, God, she must have been miserable. But here's the pattern interrupt. In the 13th century, if you weren't wearing a wimple, you weren't free. You were either a child, a sex worker, or so dirt poor that you couldn't afford a piece of hemmed linen. The wimple wasn't a cage, it was a crown. It was the power suit of the High Middle Ages. It signaled that you were a woman of standing, a woman of a household, and most importantly, a woman who was untouchable. If we look at the practicality of the wimple, it's actually a genius-tier invention. It protected your skin from the sun in an era before SPF. It kept your hair, which you didn't wash every day, clean and out of the way while you were managing a manor or brewing ale. And in terms of style, the sheer variety of how women pinned these things would make a modern hijab stylist's head spin. We have records of fashionable wimples made of silk so thin they were basically transparent, which, again, drove the church absolutely insane because it defeated the purpose of modesty. But why do I say it changed the global economy? Because the demand for the fine linen used in these veils is what built the trade routes between Flanders, France, and Italy. The modest head covering was the fuel for the fire of early capitalism. So, when we place the wimple on our tier list, we have to ask ourselves, are we ranking it based on how much we hate it now or how much it did for women then? Because if you were a 12th century woman and you forgot your wimple, it wasn't a fashion faux pas. It was a social catastrophe that could get you hauled before a magistrate for public indecency. But as much as the wimple dominated the early centuries, it eventually faced a rival so tall, so heavy, and so structurally impossible that it forced architects to literally change the height of castle doorways. Enter the hennin. If the wimple was about modesty and social order, the hennin was about pure, unadulterated, main character energy. It is the cone-shaped hat that has become the universal shorthand for princess. But here is the reality of the hennin. It wasn't just a hat. It was a feat of engineering that relied on wire frames, velvet tension, and a level of balance that would put a professional gymnast to shame. Imagine walking into a room wearing a 2-foot-tall cone made of gold brocade silk, draped with a 5-foot-long veil of transparent lawn. You can't look down, or it falls off. You can't look up too fast, or you'll snap your neck. You have to navigate every door sideways like a crab. Is this comfortable? Absolutely not. It's an instrument of torture. Is it practical? It's the least practical object ever conceived by the human mind. But is it style? In the year 1450, if you walked into the Burgundian court without a hennin, you might as well have walked in naked. It was the ultimate flex. It said, I am so rich and my life is so easy that I can spend my entire day balancing a structural masterpiece on my forehead while my servants do everything else. This is the central tension of medieval fashion. We move from the chemise, pure practicality, to the wimple, social necessity, to the hennin, insane luxury. But there's one garment we haven't touched yet, a garment that exists in the weird, blurry space between a dress and a coat, a garment that was so oversized, so heavy, and so filled with fabric that it was actually used as a form of currency. We're talking about the houppelande. The houppelande is the weighted blanket of the 15th century. It features sleeves so large they frequently dragged on the floor, and hems so long they required a dedicated team of pages just to help you move from the bed to the table. It was the peak of, look how much fabric I can afford to waste. If the cote-hardie was about showing the body, the houppelande was about hiding it under a mountain of wealth. It's the reason why, in every 15th century painting, everyone looks like a very expensive, very triangular tent. But here is the mystery. Why did fashion flip-flop so violently? Why go from the tight, devil snare tailoring of the 1300s to the massive engulfing tents of the 1400s? The answer isn't taste. The answer is the Black Death. When a third of the population dies, the survivors suddenly find themselves very, very rich. They inherited the clothes, the money, and the lands of their dead relatives. Suddenly, everyone had opulent money. The middle class exploded, and they wanted to look like royalty. This led to the arms race of fashion. If the merchant's wife is wearing a opulent with 5 yards of velvet, the duchess is going to wear one with 15. If the merchant's wife has a 1-foot hennin, the queen is going to have a 3-foot one with a wire frame shaped like a butterfly. We are ranking a millennium of style, but what we are really ranking is the human ego. We are ranking the desperate need to stand out in a world that was constantly trying to kill you. So, let's look at the board. We have the chemise, the cote-hardie, the sideless surcoat, the wimple, the hennin, and the houppelande. One of these is going to be our first S tier. One of these is the absolute god tier of medieval fashion. You might think it's the hennin because it's iconic. You might think it's the surcoat because it's scandalous. But the truth is, the most S-tier garment in this entire list is something most of you haven't even noticed in the background of these paintings. It's a piece of clothing that was so successful, it didn't change for 400 years. It survived plagues, wars, and the fall of empires without ever going out of style. And if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, it was the only thing standing between you and total social ruin. But before we place it on the board, I have to tell you the one thing about medieval fashion that no one ever mentions. The one thing that makes all of these S-tier rankings irrelevant. Because while we've been talking about the clothes, we've ignored the most important part of the look, the part that medieval women spent more time on than their dresses, their veils, or even their shoes. I'm talking about the forehead. In the Middle Ages, your hair was your glory, but your forehead was your status. And if you think a high-waisted dress is a commitment, you have no idea what these women were willing to do to their own faces just to reach the A tier of beauty. You think you know what suffering for fashion means. You haven't seen anything yet. Because the real historical fail wasn't the dress. It was the lengths women went to look like they had never seen a day of sunlight in their lives. Let's get the first item on the board. We're starting with the foundation of everything, the garment that every woman from the queen to the peasant owned. The chemise. Is it S tier, or is it just a boring necessity? Let's find out. Let's score the chemise. Comfort? 10 out of 10. It's soft, breathable linen that gets softer every time you boil it. Practicality? Unmatched. It absorbs your sweat, protects your hyper-expensive outerwear from your body oils, and literally keeps you from dying of bacterial skin infections. But style? It's a sack. It is a literal white rectangle with armholes. If you are walking around 14th century London in just a chemise, you aren't making a fashion statement. You are having a public breakdown. The chemise lands solidly in A tier. It is the absolute workhorse of the medieval wardrobe, carrying the entire hygiene system of Europe on its back. But it misses the S tier because on its own, it has zero drip. But you couldn't just throw on your chemise and call it a day. Before you even touched your outer layers, you had to address your face. And this is where medieval beauty standards get absolutely unhinged. Forget the corset. The most painful medieval beauty trend happened from the eyebrows up. In the 14th and 15th centuries, a massive, bulbous, egg-like forehead was the ultimate pinnacle of eroticism. A high hairline meant you were aristocratic. It meant your face was open and pure. But human biology doesn't naturally produce 5-inch foreheads. So, how did they get the look? They chemically peeled their scalps. Women would mix quicklime, bat blood, vinegar, and ground up arsenic into a caustic paste, rub it into their hairlines, and literally burn the hair follicles out of their skulls. They would sit for hours with this toxic sludge eating away at their skin just to push their hairlines back 2 or 3 inches. Why go through that agonizing torture? Because of what you were going to put on top of that newly acquired bald real estate. You needed a perfectly smooth foundation for the most baffling headwear of the Middle Ages, the bourrelet. Imagine taking a massive velvet sausage, stuffing it with wool, rolling it into a giant donut, and balancing it right on top of your chemically burned forehead. That is the bourrelet. In the early 15th century, this was the height of fashion. Women would pin intricately woven hairnets called cauls over their ears and crown the whole thing with this stuffed velvet pastry. Let's run it through the criteria. Comfort? It's a heavy, sweaty wool ring sitting on a chemical burn. 0. Practicality? It traps heat, throws off your center of gravity, and serves no structural purpose. Style? You look like you're balancing a luxury neck pillow on your head. The bourrelet is going straight into D tier. It is a historical fail. It was a flash-in-the-pan trend that proves wealthy people have always been willing to look ridiculous as long as it proved they were rich. But you know what isn't a fail? The garment that revolutionized human clothing forever. The invention that finally allowed women to stop wearing formless sacks and actually show off the human body. We are pulling the cotehardie up to the board. To understand why the cotehardie was a nuclear bomb in medieval society, you have to understand the magic of the bias cut. Before the 1340s, weavers cut fabric straight across the grain. It didn't stretch, it just hung there. But some absolute genius figured out that if you cut the wool diagonally on the bias, the fabric suddenly had elasticity. It could stretch, it could cling. Combine that with the mass production of the button, and the cotehardie was born. For the first time in European history, a dress could be tailored skin-tight from the shoulder to the hip before flaring out into a massive, sweeping skirt. Women were sewing themselves into these gowns every single morning for a flawless, painted-on fit. You had tight sleeves. You had a defined waist. You had a plunging, wide neckline that showed off the collarbones. The moral panic was instantaneous. Monks were writing furious treatises claiming these dresses were so tight they were restricting women's breathing, ironic, since modern Hollywood still thinks they were using corsets. The church declared the cotehardie a fast track to damnation, but women didn't care. They just kept adding more buttons. We have surviving cotehardies with up to 50 buttons running down the front and up the sleeves. Why? Because buttons were incredibly expensive. If you had 50 buttons, you were walking around wearing a small fortune in brass, silver, or bone. Comfort? Surprisingly high. The bias-cut wool moved with you like a medieval yoga pant. Practicality? You needed a servant to help you button yourself in, but once you were in, you had a full range of motion. Style? Unstoppable. It defined the medieval silhouette. The cotehardie is our first S-tier garment. It is a masterpiece of early tailoring, and honestly, if you wore one to a red carpet today, you would easily make the best-dressed list. But the cotehardie wasn't worn alone. It was the foundation for the most scandalous item on our list. The garment that the church literally named the windows to hell. Let's rank the sideless surcoat. Take a long, flowing gown. Now, cut the armholes so deep that they extend from the shoulder all the way down to the hip bone. When you put it on over your tight-fitting cotehardie, you create a visual illusion. The deep cutouts act like massive arrows pointing directly at your waist and hips. If the cotehardy made the church angry, the sideless surcoat sent them into an absolute meltdown. They argued that these gaping side holes were literal traps set by demons to lure men's eyes. And they were right about the luring part, but demons had nothing to do with it. This was pure, calculated fashion. But there was a catch. To make a sideless surcoat actually look good, it had to be lined with fur. And not just any fur. Vair. Vair was made from the belly pelts of hundreds of tiny Eurasian squirrels, sewn together in an alternating gray and white checkerboard pattern. It was astronomically expensive. By the way, quick historical detour. In the original French Cinderella story, her slipper was made of vair, squirrel fur. A later translator mistook it for vair, glass. Cinderella wasn't wearing glass stilettos. She was wearing medieval squirrel fur booties, back to the surcoat. Is it S tier? Comfort is high. It's essentially a fur-lined vest. Style is a solid 10 out of 10. It screams absolute majesty. But practicality? If you have massive, gaping holes in the sides of your coat, it's not exactly keeping the winter wind out, is it? You are sacrificing warmth entirely for the aesthetic. Because of that fatal flaw, the sideless surcoat drops just slightly into A tier. It is an iconic, boss-level garment, but you will freeze to death if you wear it in January. So, what do you wear in January? How do you stay warm while still making sure every peasant in a 10-mile radius knows you make more money in a day than they will see in a lifetime? You put on a houppelande. The houppelande is the single most aggressive display of wealth in the Middle Ages. Remember, fabric was cash. The houppelande was a coat so massive, so heavily pleated, and so ridiculously oversized that it required between 10 to 15 yards of heavy wool or velvet. The sleeves were cut in a shape called the bagpipe, which tells you everything you need to know. They were huge, billowing sacks of fabric that literally dragged on the mud when you walked. But dragging your silk in the mud wasn't an accident. It was the point. If you are letting your 500 florin velvet drag through horse manure, you are sending a very specific message. I am so wealthy. I don't care if I destroy this fabric. I will just buy more. To keep the edge of these massive sleeves from completely unraveling, tailors used a technique called dagging. They would cut the edges into intricate shapes, oak leaves, scallops, flames. It required insane scissor skills and meant the fabric couldn't be hemmed, which meant it frayed faster, which meant you had to replace it sooner. It was medieval fast fashion, but for billionaires. Let's rank it. Comfort? You are wearing 40 pounds of wool. It's like walking around inside a carpet. Practicality? You can barely lift your arms to eat. You need pages to carry your sleeves so you don't trip down the stairs and snap your neck. Style? It completely obliterates the human shape. It turns you into a walking velvet triangle. Despite being the ultimate status symbol of the 1400s, the houppelande goes into C tier. It is pure ego, zero function. It's the medieval equivalent of wearing a giant, unwearable Balenciaga meme coat just for the Instagram photo. But you couldn't wear a massive triangular houppelande and leave your head looking small. The proportions would be off. You needed something to balance out the extreme width of the coat. This is the exact reason the hennin was invented. We talked about it earlier, the tall, conical princess hat. But what Hollywood gets wrong is how it stayed on. It didn't just sit on top of the head. A true hennin featured a small wire loop that sat flat against the forehead. You pulled your hair tightly back, strapped the cone on, and the tension of the wire against your plucked, chemically burned forehead kept it upright. It was an architectural nightmare. Some of these hennons were 3 feet tall. To make matters worse, women would drape transparent silk veils over the tip, letting them trail all the way down to the floor. If a rogue wind caught that veil, it would rip the hennon right off your head, taking your remaining hair with it. You had to walk smoothly. You couldn't nod. You had to duck through every doorway in the castle. Comfort, abysmal. Practicality, negative. Style. It is the most universally recognized medieval garment in modern history. It is the definition of iconic. Because it fails so hard on the physical criteria, but succeeds so brilliantly on the cultural impact, the hennon balances out into B tier. It is a glorious structural hazard. But while the nobles were busy breaking their necks on doorways, what was everyone else wearing? If you weren't a duchess dripping in squirrel fur, how did you survive the Middle Ages? You relied on the peasant head covering, specifically the St. Birgitta cap. If the hennon is a Lamborghini, the St. Birgitta cap is a Toyota Corolla. It is a simple, white linen cap that cups the back of the head, with 2 long straps that cross over the top and tie at the nape of the neck. It looks incredibly basic. You see it in every medieval farming painting. But the engineering is flawless. When you tie those straps, it pulls the linen tight around your hairline, locking all your hair safely out of the way. It keeps the dust out while you're threshing wheat. It catches your sweat while you're baking bread. It's washable, it's cheap, and it requires 0 pins. Let's rank it. Comfort, 10 out of 10. Practicality, 10 out of 10. It literally allowed the working class of Europe to function without getting their hair caught in looms or churning butter with dirty hands. Style, it's humble, but it has a clean, minimalist aesthetic that works. I'm putting the St. Birgitta cap in S tier. That's right, the peasant cap beats the princess hat. Why? Because survival is the ultimate flex. Without the working women wearing these caps, the entire medieval economy would have collapsed in a week. S tier for the unsung heroes of history. But what if you were somewhere in the middle? What if you were a wealthy merchant's wife, but sumptuary laws legally forbade you from wearing velvet or vair? How did you cheat the system? You used the ultimate 15th century life hack, false sleeves. This is a secret that completely changes how you watch period dramas. In the Middle Ages, sleeves weren't permanently sewn into the dress. They were separate items. You would put on your bodice, and then use brass pins or laces to attach the sleeves at the shoulder seam. Why is this brilliant? Because you only had to buy 1 good high-quality wool dress. But you could buy 5 pairs of sleeves. You could have crimson silk sleeves for a feast, embroidered linen sleeves for church, and basic wool sleeves for the market. You could change your entire outfit just by swapping the arms. And because they weren't fully sewn in, you had a gap at the armpit. This wasn't a mistake, it was ventilation. In a world before deodorant, having an open armpit seam was a godsend. Comfort, high. Practicality, off the charts. It was modular fashion. Style, it allowed the middle class to look like the upper class on a budget. False sleeves go straight into S tier. We need to bring this back immediately. Imagine never having to wash an entire coat, because you could just detach the sleeves and wash them in the sink. We've covered the foundation, the dresses, the coats, and the hats. But we are missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. We have to look down. If you thought the hats were wild, you are completely unprepared for the sheer lunacy of medieval footwear. Let's rank the poulain, also known as the Krakowe. In the late 14th century, someone looked at a normal leather shoe and thought, what if the toe was longer? And then someone else said, what if it was even longer? This escalated into a full-blown footwear arms race. Poulains were leather shoes with pointed toes that extended so far past the foot that they became literal tripping hazards. We are talking toes that were 6, 12, sometimes 24 inches long. They were stuffed with moss or horsehair just to keep them stiff. They got so long that the church, who, frankly, had a lot of free time to get mad at clothing, declared them the devil's fingers. But it got worse. The toes became so unmanageable that people had to attach silver chains to the tip of the shoe and tie them to their knees just so they could walk upstairs. And naturally, kings had to get involved. The sumptuary laws of 1363 in England legally mandated the length of your toe based on your income. A commoner was allowed a 2-inch toe, a knight could have a 6-inch toe, a baron could rock a 12-inch toe, and a prince? A prince could have a shoe 2 feet longer than his actual foot. Comfort? You are walking in flippers. Practicality? You can't ride a horse. You can't kneel to pray. And if you have to run from a mugger in a dark alley, you are going to faceplant immediately. Style? You look like a court jester. Poulains are the undisputed king of the D tier. They are the single dumbest fashion trend of the entire millennium. A total historical fail. So where does that leave our board? We have S tiers in the coat hardy, the peasant cap, and false sleeves. We have D tiers in the bourrelet and the poulains. But there is one item left. It's sitting right in the middle of the table. It's the garment I promised you would actually change the way you see the entire medieval period. It isn't French. It isn't English. It comes from the dark, cold forests of the Holy Roman Empire, and it is about to completely shatter everything you think you know about medieval modesty. Because while the rest of Europe was busy covering their heads in veils and hiding their bodies in massive wool houppelons, the women of Germany decided to go rogue. They invented a dress so visually disruptive, so aggressively complex, that it looks like someone took a pair of scissors and went absolutely feral on a runway piece. If you think slashed jeans are a modern invention, prepare to have your mind blown. We have to talk about the Cranach gown and why destroying your clothes on purpose was the ultimate power move. You've seen the paintings. Women standing there, looking incredibly smug, wearing velvet gowns that look like they've been dragged through a wood chipper. This is the German gown, made famous by the artist Lucas Cranach, and it introduces us to the wildest trend of the late Middle Ages: slashing. The concept is insane. You take a pair of shears to your hyper-expensive wool or velvet outer layer, cut massive slits into the arms, the chest, and the thighs, and then physically pull your bright, billowing silk underlayer through the holes so it puffs out like little clouds. To a modern eye, it looks chaotic. To a medieval eye, it was a display of wealth so aggressive it was practically violent. Why? Because you are destroying your own luxury goods just to prove you have even more luxury goods underneath. You are ruining a 50 florin velvet bodice just to show off a 100 florin silk chemise. It is the 16th century equivalent of buying a brand new Ferrari and immediately keying the doors to show everyone you can afford a second one. But the real secret of the Cranach gown isn't the wealth. It's the origin. This trend wasn't started by queens. It was started by the Landsknecht, the terrifying, ruthless German mercenary soldiers. They survived brutal battles, stripped the expensive clothes off the dead nobility, slashed the tight garments to fit their own massive, muscular frames, and swaggered back into town. It was the ultimate punk rock, anti-establishment look. And what did the noble women do? They stole it. They took the blood-soaked streetwear of sociopathic mercenaries and turned it into high fashion. Let's score the Cranach gown. Comfort? Surprisingly high. The slashes release the tension of the fabric, giving you ventilation and a full range of arm motion. Practicality? Horrendous. Those little puffs of silk caught on everything: door handles, briars, passing dogs. You snag a puff, and your entire chemise unravels. But style? It is peerless. It is dangerous. It tells the room you are rich, trendy, and slightly unhinged. The Cranach gown punches its way straight into S tier. But there's a massive problem with S tier fashion. Once you hit the top, everybody wants to copy you. And when everybody copies you, the government gets involved. We've talked about sumptuary laws, but you have no idea how petty the medieval fashion police actually were. They couldn't outlaw slashing completely, so they started passing laws dictating exactly how many slashes you were legally allowed to have. You may have one slash on the right arm, but if you have two, we will fine you. So how did you beat the system? How did you flaunt your status when the law literally banned you from looking too good? You didn't use fabric. You used accessories. And that brings us to the most misunderstood item in the medieval woman's arsenal. Let's talk about the girdle. If you watch a Hollywood movie, the girdle is just a leather belt holding a tunic together. Boring, functional, irrelevant, wrong. In the Middle Ages, your girdle was your Swiss Army knife, your credit card, and your LinkedIn profile all rolled into one. Noble women wore girdles made of solid silver, studded with enamel and pearls, so heavy they pulled the front of the dress down into that classic medieval pregnant-looking silhouette. But the real flex wasn't the belt itself. It was what hung from it. Women wore chatelaines' intricate chains dangling from the girdle that held small, vital tools: shears for needlework, a tiny knife for cutting meat at feasts, a pomander ball stuffed with cloves and ambergris to sniff when you walked past an open sewer. But the ultimate status symbol on the girdle? Keys. If a woman walked into a hall with a massive ring of iron keys clinking against her hips, you bowed your head. Those keys meant she controlled the household. She locked the spice cabinets. She locked the wine cellar. She controlled the economy of the entire estate. A knight might have a sword, but his wife had the keys, and in the Middle Ages, the one who controlled the cinnamon controlled the power. Comfort? It's a heavy metal chain dragging on your hips. Not great. Practicality? Unbeatable. It's Batman's utility belt for the 14th century. Style? 10 out of 10. Nothing says, "I'm the boss," like the metallic sound of your arrival echoing down a stone corridor. The girdle lands squarely in A tier. It is the ultimate accessory of authority. But what if you didn't care about earthly authority? What if you had given up the physical world to become a bride of Christ? You'd think the fashion stopped at the convent door, right? You would be dead wrong. It's time to rank the nun's habit. We think of nuns as the ultimate picture of modesty. Black robes, white wimples, total rejection of vanity. But medieval nuns were notorious fashion rule breakers. Remember, these women weren't always deeply spiritual. Many of them were the second and third daughters of billionaires, dumped into convents because their fathers didn't want to pay a marriage dowry. You take a bunch of hyper-wealthy, aristocratic teenagers, lock them in an abbey, and tell them to wear plain wool. What do you think is going to happen? Absolute chaos. Bishops were constantly writing furious letters to abbacies, begging the nuns to stop tailoring their habits to be skin-tight. Nuns were secretly lining their coarse wool robes with expensive squirrel fur. They were weaving golden threads into their wimples. They were keeping lapdogs and monkeys as accessories, tucking them into those massive bagpipe sleeves we talked about earlier. In 1318, The Archbishop of York literally had to issue a mandate commanding the nuns under his watch to stop wearing silk belts, stop plucking their eyebrows, and stop wearing their veils pinned so far back that you could see their hair. The nun's habit was supposed to be the ultimate equalizer. Instead, it became a canvas for stealth wealth. Let's rank it. Comfort? It's a giant, loose-fitting wool blanket. 10 out of 10. Practicality? It kept you warm in unheated stone cloisters. Style? On the surface, a 0. But the moment you realize these women were secretly flexing on the Pope by tailoring their armholes, that is pure icon behavior. The nun's habit sneaks into B tier. It's the original, quiet luxury. But the nuns had a secret every woman in the Middle Ages shared, one that Hollywood has desperately tried to convince you didn't exist. We need to talk about what was happening underneath the chemise. For decades, historians looked at medieval art, saw women with impossibly high, perfectly round busts, and assumed it was all achieved through dress tailoring. The academic consensus was firm. Medieval women did not wear bras. They simply tied their dresses tight and hoped for the best. And then, in 2008, an archaeological earthquake hit. During the renovation of Lengberg Castle in Austria, workers pulled up the floorboards and found a hidden vault filled with 15th century garbage. Inside that garbage, linen undergarments. Not just shifts, not just chemises, bra. They found linen garments with distinct tailored cups, shoulder straps, and laces down the side. The medieval texts called them breast bags. Suddenly, the entire narrative collapsed. Women weren't just free-swinging their way through the 14th century. They had engineered functional, supportive underwear hundreds of years before Victoria's Secret claimed to have invented the modern silhouette. This changes everything about how we view the practicality of medieval fashion. Women were riding horses, running farms, and fighting off sieges. You think they were doing that without support? Please. Because we don't have enough surviving examples to judge the external style, I can't put the Lengberg bra in S tier. But for purely rewriting the history books and proving that women have always been the ultimate engineers of their own comfort, the breast bag easily secures an A-tier spot. So the foundation is secure. The underwear is functional. The outer layers are heavily tailored and slashed. We are nearing the pinnacle of the tier list. But there is a glaring omission. We have completely ignored the single piece of clothing that dominated the streets, the battlefields, and the royal courts simultaneously. It is a garment so versatile that it was worn by kings, queens, and the guy shoveling manure. I'm talking about the tabard. To picture a tabard, imagine a poncho. It is a large rectangle of fabric with a hole cut in the middle for your head, entirely open at the sides. Originally, it was worn by monks. Then, knights threw it over their armor to keep the sun from baking them alive inside their metal suits. But then, the fashion girlies got a hold of it. Why would a noblewoman wear a knight's sweaty poncho? For the exact same reason modern people wear massive logos on their hoodies. The tabard was medieval branding. Because it was a massive flat surface of fabric, it was the perfect canvas for heraldry. If you married into a powerful family, you didn't just tell people. You wore a silk tabard with your father's coat of arms embroidered on the right side and your husband's coat of arms on the left. It was a walking billboard of your bloodline. When you wore a tabard, you weren't a person anymore. You were an institution. Comfort? 10 out of 10. It's a literal blanket with a head hole. Practicality? Perfect. It protects your expensive underdresses from the elements. Style? It is bold, it is graphic, and it is unapologetic. But it has one fatal flaw. If the wind blows, you are completely exposed. And if your family loses a war, wearing their logo in public is a great way to get yourself assassinated. Because of the high political risk, the tabard gets bumped down to B tier. It's high risk, high reward fashion. Let's take a breath and look at the board. We have the cote-hardy and the false sleeves reigning supreme in S tier, the bourrelet and the poulains rotting in D tier, the chemise and the girdle holding strong in A tier. But we still have one space left at the absolute top. We need a garment that transcends time, a garment that was so universally flattering, so infinitely customizable, and so undeniably powerful, that it defined the visual language of an entire continent. To find it, we have to look away from the waistlines and the weird hats. We have to look at the ultimate canvas of medieval wealth. We have to talk about the cloak. I know what you're thinking. A cloak? Really? It's just a cape. If you think a medieval cloak is just a cape, you fundamentally misunderstand the economics of the 12th century. The cloak was the medieval equivalent of a private jet. It was the largest continuous piece of uncut fabric a human being could purchase. In a world where every single thread was spun by hand on a drop spindle, woven by hand on a massive wooden loom, and dyed by hand using crushed bugs and toxic chemicals, fabric was more stable than gold. A high-quality wool cloak took hundreds of hours of human labor just to create the raw material. When Eleanor of Aquitaine walked into a room, she didn't just wear a cloak. She wore a half-circle mantle of spun silk, lined entirely with the winter pelts of ermine, fastened at the collar with a solid gold brooch the size of a dinner plate. But the genius of the cloak is the drama. It is the only garment on this list that requires choreography. You can't just walk in a medieval mantle. You have to sweep. You have to drape it over one shoulder to reveal the contrasting silk lining. You have to dramatically throw it back when you sit down. It is an interactive piece of clothing. And more importantly, it was the ultimate legal loophole. Remember those sumptuary laws we talked about? The ones that said you couldn't wear certain colors? The laws usually applied to the dress. They didn't always apply to the lining of the cloak. So, if you were a wealthy merchant trying to flex on a duke, you would wear a plain brown wool cloak. But when the wind blew, it revealed a flash of illegal, hyper-expensive crimson silk underneath. It was flashing. But for capitalism, let's run the final numbers. Comfort? It's a massive, warm hug. 10 out of 10. Practicality? It doubles as a blanket when you travel, protects you from rain, and hides a multitude of sins. 10 out of 10. Style? It is the undisputed heavyweight champion of dramatic entrances. The mantle, the great medieval cloak, is our final S-tier item. It is the alpha and omega of historical fashion. But before we finalize this tier list, I have to throw a wrench into everything we just built. We've ranked all these garments based on what they looked like. But we haven't talked about the invisible killer, the silent, toxic element of medieval fashion that literally poisoned the people who wore it. Because what good is an S-tier dress if the color of the fabric is actively melting your nervous system? You think toxic fashion is a modern problem? Let me introduce you to the deadly reality of medieval dyes. If you wanted to project absolute, unquestionable dominance in a medieval court, you wore red. Not just any red. You wore vermilion. It was the color of kings, of cardinals, of blood, and of power. But to get that specific eye-searing crimson, dyers had to use a mineral called cinnabar. Cinnabar is naturally occurring mercury sulfide. When you wore a vermilion gown, You were sweating inside a toxic cocoon. The dyers who boiled the vats went mad from the fumes, their nervous systems short-circuiting, and the women who wore the finished garments absorbed the heavy metals directly through their pores. You were literally poisoning yourself to prove you were rich. But vermilion wasn't the fastest way to die for your wardrobe. If you wanted a quick exit, you asked your tailor for green. The most fashionable green of the 14th century was verdigris. To make it, dyers took copper plates, sealed them in vats of fermenting wine, and scraped off the toxic, corrosive green rust that bloomed on the metal. It was a spectacular, vibrant emerald color. The catch: the copper acetate was so acidic it actively ate the fabric. A verdigris dress had an incredibly short shelf life before it literally dissolved on your body. You weren't just wearing poison, you were wearing an hourglass. If you showed up to a feast in verdigris, you were telling the room, "I am so wealthy, I can afford to buy a dress that will destroy itself by Tuesday." Let's rank the toxic dyes. Comfort? -10. It's heavy metal poisoning. Practicality? It rots the silk. Style? Unmatched vibrancy that proved you didn't care about your own lifespan. Toxic dyes land in C tier. They looked incredible right up until your teeth started falling out. But what if you wanted to flex your wealth without the chemical warfare? What if you wanted to wear something that wouldn't dissolve, but would instead crush you under its own weight? This brings us to the most unhinged textile of the Middle Ages, cloth of gold. When you hear cloth of gold, you probably imagine yellow silk. You are vastly underestimating medieval extravagance. Cloth of gold wasn't yellow. It was literal, physical gold. Master artisans would take a solid block of gold, beat it into paper-thin sheets, cut it into microscopic ribbons, and physically wrap it around silk threads. Then, they wove it into a dress. You were wearing jewelry as a coat. A full gown made of cloth of gold could weigh upwards of 50 pounds. It was so stiff, so heavy, and so rigid that you physically could not bend your knees to sit down. If you sat, the metal threads would permanently crease and snap. You had to stand for hours, essentially locked inside a glittering, golden cage. Comfort? You are a human statue. Practicality? You require 2 attendants just to help you walk to the buffet table. Style? You are a walking solar flare. It blinded the peasants and asserted your divine right to rule. Because it is the ultimate intersection of power and paralysis, cloth of gold goes straight into B tier. It is breathtaking, but you will need a medieval chiropractor. And if you think a 50-pound dress is a mobility nightmare, you haven't looked at their feet yet. Let me take you to Venice, to the absolute peak of the 15th century footwear arms race. We already roasted the poulains, the stupidly long, pointy shoes worn by men. Now it's the women's turn. We have to rank the Chopin. Imagine a platform shoe. Now imagine it is made of carved cork or wood. Now make it 5 inches tall. Now make it 10. Now make it 20. That is the Chopin. It was a stilt masquerading as a shoe. The streets of Venice were notoriously muddy, flooded, and filled with human waste. Originally, these platforms were designed to keep your incredibly expensive silk hems out of the literal crap in the streets. But then, the ego took over. Women realized that the taller the shoe, the taller the dress. And the taller the dress, the more yards of fabric you could force your husband to buy. Chopins became real estate. They got so absurdly high that noblewomen physically could not walk. They had to lean on the shoulders of 2 flanking servants just to waddle across the piazza. The Venetian Senate actually tried to ban them, not because they were modest, but because pregnant noblewomen kept tripping off their 20-inch platforms and suffering catastrophic falls. The laws mandated a maximum height of 3 inches. Did the women listen? Absolutely not. They just started hiding the platform entirely under the hem of the dress, gliding across the floor like terrifying 12-foot-tall hovercrafts. Let's score it. Comfort? You are balancing on a wooden skyscraper. Practicality? You are entirely dependent on other human beings for locomotion. Style? It is the most aggressive power play in Italian history because of the sheer audacity required to wear a shoe that might actually kill you if you step on a cobblestone wrong. The Chopin teeters right into A tier. It is dangerous, it is fabulous, and it is the mother of the modern stiletto. But Venice didn't have a monopoly on dangerous accessories. While the Italians were risking their ankles, the French and English were starting a war with the church over the shape of their heads. We've covered the conical hennin. Now we have to talk about its wicked sister, the horned headdress or the cornet. Take a wire frame, bend it into 2 massive protruding horns, cover it in gold mesh, stuff it with padding, and drape a massive veil over the top. When you walked into a cathedral, you looked like a deeply glamorous ram. The clergy lost their absolute minds. They didn't just write letters. They incited riots. A Carmelite friar named Thomas Connect made it his life's mission to destroy the horned headdress. He would stand in the town squares of France, preaching that these women were literal demons wearing the horns of Satan. He would offer indulgences, basically get-out-of-hell-free cards to street children if they chased these noblewomen down, screaming, "Beware the ram," and throwing mud and stones at them. You'd think the women would stop wearing them. You'd think being assaulted in the street by a mob of screaming toddlers would be enough to kill a trend. You underestimate medieval women. The moment Friar Thomas left a town, the women didn't just put the horns back on. They commissioned their tailors to make them bigger. It was spite fashion. It was a direct, visual middle finger to the ecclesiastical authority. You think I look like a demon? Watch me add a 3-foot silk veil to these horns and sit in the front row of Mass. Comfort? It's a wire frame digging into your scalp. Practicality? You are knocking over candles every time you turn your head. Style? 10 out of 10 for pure, concentrated rebellion. The horned headdress is an S-tier legend. Any garment that can survive a coordinated attack by the Catholic Church and come out larger on the other side deserves the absolute highest respect. But you couldn't just throw a horned headdress on your naked, chemically burned head. You had to match the face to the vibe, and the vibe was corpse chic. Forget modern contouring. The medieval beauty standard demanded skin so pale, so unblemished, and so translucent that you looked like you had never seen the sun in your life. A tan meant you worked in the fields. Pale meant you sat in a castle. How did you achieve that ghostly glow? You painted your face with ceruse. Ceruse was a foundation made of white lead and vinegar. It gave you a flawless porcelain finish. It also slowly ate away at your epidermis. The lead would cause severe scarring, cystic acne, and skin discoloration. So what did you do when the ceruse ruined your skin? You applied a thicker layer of ceruse to hide the scars. It was a lethal, self-fulfilling loop that eventually led to lead poisoning, hair loss, and sometimes death. If you want to know why so many medieval portraits feature women with no eyebrows, it wasn't always a fashion choice. Sometimes the lead foundation literally dissolved the hair follicles right off their faces. Let's rank medieval cosmetics. Comfort? Your face is burning. Practicality? You are painting yourself with poison. Style? You look like a beautiful ghost, right up until the toxicity hits your brain. Ceruse goes into the F tier. It is a historical disaster, a tragedy of vanity. We've spent a lot of time on the extravagant, the toxic, and the insane, the S tiers and the F tiers, but we are missing the backbone of the era. If you strip away the velvet, the cloth of gold, the horns, and the poison, what is left? What did the actual, everyday woman, the baker, the brewer, the merchant's wife wear when she woke up in the morning? It's time to rank the most important garment of the entire millennium. A dress so perfect, so structurally sound, that it didn't just survive the Middle Ages, it built the modern silhouette. Bring out the kirtle. If the chemise is your underwear, and the surcoat is your jacket, the kirtle is the dress. It is the middle layer. But it wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was an engineering marvel. For the everyday woman, the kirtle was tightly fitted through the bodice and flared at the skirt, but it didn't use buttons. Buttons were for the rich. The kirtle used laced eyelets. And this is where every single Hollywood movie gets it wrong. When you watch a period drama, you see women being laced into dresses using metal grommets, with the laces crisscrossing like a modern sneaker. False. Metal grommets weren't invented until the 19th century. Medieval women used awls to pierce holes in the linen, then hand-stitched the edges of the holes with incredibly tight thread to reinforce them. And they didn't crisscross the lace, they spiral-laced. You take one long cord, tie a knot at the bottom, and spiral it up through the holes like a corkscrew. Why? Because spiral lacing distributes tension perfectly across the torso. When a woman pulled that single string tight, the wool or linen molded to her body, providing massive bust support, core stability, and a flawless shape. You didn't need a bra if your kirtle was cut and laced correctly. It held you in like medieval shapewear, but because it was custom tailored to your exact measurements, it didn't restrict your breathing. You could harvest wheat in it. You could chop wood in it. And because it was usually dyed with cheap, reliable dyes like madder root for a rusty red or woad for a deep blue, it hid dirt perfectly. Comfort? 10 out of 10. Its custom-fitted support. Practicality? 10 out of 10. It is the ultimate working-class uniform. Style? It gave every single woman, regardless of her class, a snatched waist and a supported bust. The kirtle is not just S tier. It is God tier. It is the absolute pinnacle of human clothing evolution. If we brought back the spiral-laced kirtle today, the fast fashion industry would collapse overnight. But what if you were wearing your God-tier kirtle and the weather dropped? You couldn't afford a massive, fur-lined houppelande. You couldn't afford a silk mantle. You needed to stay warm, but you needed to keep your hands free to work. You reached for the chaperone. Originally, the chaperone was just a hood with a capelet attached to it, worn by monks and peasants. It kept the rain off your neck. But right around the late 14th century, someone made a mistake that changed fashion forever. Someone grabbed their hood, but instead of putting their face through the face hole, they jammed their head through the face hole, letting the cape part flop over one side of their head and the tail of the hood, the lyra pipe, dangle down the other. It looked like a magnificent, chaotic fabric crown. Instantly, it became the hottest trend in Europe. Both men and women started wearing their hoods inside out and upside down. Eventually, tailors stopped making them as hoods altogether and just started sewing them permanently into these twisted, donut-like turban shapes. It is the ultimate example of streetwear becoming high fashion. It's the medieval equivalent of wearing your baseball cap backward, until Gucci decides to sell a pre-backward baseball cap for $1,000. Comfort? High. It's basically a wool pillow on your head. Practicality? 0. It no longer functions as a hood, and it falls off if you look down. Style? Unmatched swagger. The chaperone goes into A tier. It proves that human beings have always loved taking a functional item and wearing it wrong on purpose just to look cool. But we need to talk about the physical shape of the body. We've talked about the dresses that hugged it and the coats that hid it. But what about the times when women actively tried to mutate their natural silhouette? Enter the bum roll and the placard. If you look at 15th century art, you'll notice a very specific posture. Women are standing with their shoulders pushed way back, their hips thrust forward, and their bellies sticking out like they are 6 months pregnant. This wasn't an accident. This was the Gothic slouch. In an era plagued by famine and disease, looking thin was not a flex. Looking thin meant you were starving. A round, protruding belly meant you had access to meat, bread, and sugar. It symbolized fertility, wealth, and the fact that you owned a well-stocked larder. But not every noblewoman had a naturally round belly. So, they faked it. They wore small, crescent-shaped pads tied around their waists under their dresses to push the fabric out. They wore placards, stiffened panels of fabric on the front of the gown that intentionally added bulk to the stomach. They were physically padding their outfits to look fatter. Think about how wild that is. Modern society pushes women to wear corsets and Spanx to flatten the stomach. Medieval society pushed women to strap pillows to their torsos to make the stomach as round and prominent as possible. Comfort? You're wearing a stomach pillow. 10 out of 10. Practicality? It forces you to walk with a severe backwards lean, which is terrible for your lumbar spine. Style? In 1430, it was the height of erotic appeal. Today, you just look bloated. Because it ruins your posture but gives you an excuse to never do a crunch again, the padded belly lands in C tier. We are coming down to the wire. The tier list is almost full. We've dismantled the Hollywood myths. We've proven that women weren't wearing metal corsets, they weren't covered in mud, and they definitely weren't dressing for comfort. But there is one final myth we have to burn to the ground. If you ask anyone what the defining characteristic of a medieval woman's outfit was, they will tell you it was modesty. They will say the church ruled everything, women were oppressed, and they had to hide their hair, their skin, and their bodies. I am about to show you the garment that completely shatters that illusion. The garment that proves medieval women were masters of malicious compliance. Let's rank the transparent veil, also known as the crisp. The law was absolute. A married woman must cover her hair. Showing your hair in public if you were over the age of 16 was considered highly scandalous. It meant you were available, or worse, a woman of the night. The church demanded veils. So the women of the 14th century smiled, nodded, and went to the silk weavers of Italy. They commissioned veils made of silk so incredibly fine, so expertly spun, that it was practically invisible. It was like wearing a layer of saran wrap over your head. They would spend hours braiding their hair, threading it with gold wire and pearls, twisting it into massive, elaborate coils over their ears. Then, to obey the law, they would drape this whisper-thin, totally transparent silk veil over the whole thing. When the bishop complained, the women simply pointed to their heads and said, "What? I'm wearing a veil. My hair is covered. I am obeying the law." It was the most brilliant legal loophole in the history of fashion. It drove the moralists insane because they couldn't legally prosecute them. The women were technically following the rules while completely violating the spirit of them. And it wasn't just transparent, it was structural. They would use hot irons to crimp the edges of these veils into stiff, ruffled halos that framed the face like a picture frame, drawing every eye in the room directly to the hair they were supposed to be hiding. Comfort? It weighs less than a feather. Practicality. You have to iron it every morning, and if it snags on a splinter, it disintegrates. Style? It is the ultimate flex of passive-aggressive fashion. The transparent, crisp veil goes into the S tier. It is a masterclass in beating the patriarchy at its own game. But wait. If you are going to show off your hair under a transparent veil, it has to be the right color. And the right color in the 14th century wasn't brown. It wasn't black. It was blonde. Long before peroxide was invented, medieval women were bleaching their hair. If you weren't naturally blonde, you had to undergo a chemical process that makes modern highlights look like child's play. Women would mix lye, wood ash, saffron, and onion skins into a thick paste. They would slather this caustic nightmare into their hair, put on a special hat with a hole cut out of the top, pull the hair through the hole, and sit in the blazing sun for hours. The hat protected their pale, lead-painted skin from getting a tan, while the sun baked the lye into the hair, physically stripping the pigment out of the strands. It burned. It caused massive chemical breakage. But when you washed it out, you had the shimmering, golden yellow hair of an aristocratic angel. You combine the chemically burned high forehead, the lye-bleached blonde hair, the transparent silk veil, the plucked eyebrows, the toxic lead foundation, the tight-laced spiral kirtle, the gaping sideless surcoat lined with squirrel fur, and the 20-inch wooden platform shoes. That is your true, historically accurate medieval noblewoman. She is a terrifying, highly engineered, toxic masterpiece. She is balancing on stilts, sweating in poison, and legally outmaneuvering the Pope just to show off her sleeves. She wasn't a drab, muddy peasant waiting for the Renaissance to save her. She was the architect of her own aesthetic, fighting a daily war against gravity, chemistry, and sumptuary laws. Let's look at the final board. In the D tier, the trash heap of history, we have the bourrelet, the head sausage, the poulains, the tripping hazard, and the ceruse, the face-melting lead. These were the fads that pushed vanity past the point of basic human survival. In the C tier, we have the houppelande, the velvet tent, the toxic dyes, the literal poison, and the padded belly, the Gothic slouch. They were status symbols, but they sacrificed every ounce of physical practicality for the sake of the flex. In the B tier, the high-risk, high-reward zone, we have the hennin, the doorway's worst enemy, the tabard, the walking billboard, the nun's habit, stealth wealth, and cloth of gold, the 50-pound prison. Beautiful, iconic, but structurally deeply flawed. In the A tier, the reliable icons, the chemise, the hygiene hero, the sideless surcoat, the windows to hell, the girdle, the boss-level utility belt, the Lengberg bra, the historical disruptor, the Chopin, the Venetian stilt, and the chaperone, the upside-down hood. These were the garments that defined the era and kept society functioning. But in the S tier, the God tier, the garments that changed human history, we have the cote hardie, the bias cut revolution that finally gave women a silhouette. We have the St. Birgitta cap, the unsung hero that kept the working class alive. We have the false sleeves, the modular life hack that beat the sumptuary laws. We have the Cranach gown, the punk rock / defiance of the German courts. We have the horned headdress, the ultimate spite fashion that survived a holy war. We have the transparent veil, the most brilliant legal loophole ever woven. And we have the kirtle, the spiral-laced masterpiece of engineering that supported generations of women without a single piece of metal boning. The next time you watch a movie set in the Middle Ages and you see a woman dressed in a drab brown sack or screaming while being laced into a metal corset, I want you to remember this list. I want you to remember the vibrant, toxic greens, the crushing weight of gold, the 20-inch shoes, the sheer unapologetic arrogance of a woman who would rather risk excommunication than cover up her braided hair. Fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't just clothing. It was a battlefield. It was a language. It was the only weapon many women had to assert their identity, their wealth, and their power in a world completely controlled by men. And looking at this tier list, it's clear. They didn't just fight the war. They won it. You thought we were done. You thought the board was locked. You thought the kirtle was the final boss of medieval fashion and we could all go home. I lied. Everything we just ranked the S tiers, the F tiers, the 50-pound golden dresses and the poisonous greens was legal. It was the fashion of the daylight. The approved, documented, socially acceptable wardrobe of the Middle Ages. But there is a hidden category. A tier so controversial, so deeply misunderstood by modern history, that we have to rip up the rulebook to even talk about it. Welcome to the forbidden tier. We are ranking the contraband, the survival gear, the items that women wore when the church looked away, when the sumptuary laws failed, and when their literal lives were on the line. Because if you think medieval women were just sitting around in their spiral-laced kirtles looking pretty, you are completely ignoring the brutal biological reality of the 14th century. Let's start with the biggest complaint modern women have about fashion today: fake pockets. You think the lack of pockets is a modern conspiracy? Medieval women didn't have that problem. They had the fidget. If you look closely at 13th and 14th century surcoats, you'll notice two vertical slits cut right into the front of the hips. To a modern eye, it looks like a tailor's mistake or a weird styling choice. It wasn't. It was a secret access hatch. Women didn't carry purses in their hands. They tied massive leather pouches directly to their girdles, hidden entirely beneath their outer layers. When they needed money, they simply reached their hands into the fidget, through their dress, and into the pouch. It was an invisible vault. You could carry coins, daggers, sewing shears, and nobody would ever know. Pickpockets couldn't slash your purse because your purse was literally inside your clothing. Comfort, flawless. Practicality, 10 out of 10. Style, it gave you a place to rest your hands while standing around in a freezing stone hall. The fidget is an undeniable S-tier life hack. We need to bring it back yesterday. But what good is an invisible vault if you are bleeding out on the inside? It's time to talk about the ultimate medieval taboo. The thing Hollywood absolutely refuses to put on screen. How did a medieval woman handle her period while locked inside 40 pounds of tailored wool? She reached for the clout. There were no sanitary pads in 1350. There was no cotton. Instead, women used what the earth gave them: sphagnum moss. This specific bog moss is naturally hyperabsorbent and, more importantly, mildly antimicrobial. Women would forage this moss, wrap it in layers of unbleached linen rags, called clouts, and belt it tightly beneath their chemise. It was the original, biodegradable maxi pad. When it was done, you burned the moss and washed the linen. It was a quiet, relentless cycle of biological management happening entirely beneath the velvet and the silk. Let's rank the clout. Comfort. It's a bundle of wet moss. 2 out of 10. Practicality. It literally allowed half the population to continue functioning in society for a week every month without ruining textiles that cost more than a horse. Style? Irrelevant. It's survival. The clout sneaks into B tier purely for saving medieval upholstery from total disaster. But while they were fighting biology underneath, they were fighting a literal biological weapon on the outside. The Black Death wasn't just a historical event. It was a daily, terrifying reality. And everyone knew the bites brought the plague. You are wearing layers of expensive, unwashable wool. You are sitting in drafty castles filled with dogs, rats, and straw. Fleas are everywhere. How do you protect yourself? You accessorize with a corpse. Bring out the zibellino, also known as the flea fur. In the late 15th and early 16th century, the ultra-wealthy started walking around with taxidermy weasels draped over their shoulders. But these weren't just dead animals. They were dripping in jewels. A high-end zibellino was a marten or a sable pelt fitted with a solid gold head, ruby eyes, and pearl-encrusted claws. The medical theory of the time was simple. Fleas are attracted to fur. If you wear a piece of hyper-luxurious animal fur over your silk dress, the fleas will jump onto the dead weasel instead of into your hair. Did it work? Absolutely not. Fleas want blood, not gold-plated taxidermy. But it became the ultimate morbid flex. It told the world, I am so terrified of the plague that I have commissioned a jeweler to bedazzle a dead rodent just to act as a decoy. Comfort? It's a soft pelt. Practicality? Zero medical benefit whatsoever. Style? It is unhinged, grotesque, and undeniably opulent. The zibellino is going into C tier. It's the medieval equivalent of wearing a designer hazmat suit that has a hole in it. But what happened when the plague actually hit your house? What happened when your husband died? And suddenly, you were left entirely alone in a patriarchal society. You unlocked the most powerful cheat code in the medieval matrix: widowhood. If you were a married woman, your husband owned everything. But the moment he died, you became a femme sole, an independent legal entity. You could own land. You could run a business. You could sue people in court. You had more freedom than any other demographic of women in the Middle Ages. But to keep that money and that power, you had to visually prove to the world that you were completely off the market. You had to wear the widow's weeds, and specifically, the barb. The barbe was a piece of vertically pleated, stark white linen worn over the lower half of the face and cascading down the chest. It looked like a rigid fabric beard, and the sumptuary laws around it were ruthless. If you were a duchess or a queen, you were legally allowed to pin the barbe above your chin, covering your mouth entirely. If you were a knight's wife, you had to pin it under your chin. It was a visual barricade. When a widow walked into the market wearing a barbe drawn up over her mouth, surrounded by head-to-toe black wool, it was a giant "do not touch" sign. It signaled to every greedy lord in a 10-mile radius that she was deep in mourning and could not be forced into a new marriage. The clothes bought her time. The clothes bought her freedom. Comfort. You are breathing through stiffened linen. Practicality. Unmatched. It is a wearable restraining order. Style. It is stark, terrifying, and commands absolute respect. The barbe is an A-tier masterpiece of psychological warfare. But what if you didn't want psychological warfare? What if you wanted actual, literal warfare? We have arrived at the peak. The most dangerous, the most illegal, and the most heavily punished garment a woman could possibly wear in the Middle Ages. We have to rank men's hose and the pourpoint. If a woman wore a man's jacket today, it's a fashion statement. In the 15th century, it was a capital offense, and nobody proved this more violently than Joan of Arc. Hollywood loves to show Joan riding into battle wearing full plate armor with flowing, uncovered hair. It's a lie. When Joan wasn't in armor, she wore the pourpoint, a heavily padded, skin-tight men's jacket, and attached to that jacket were her hose. Medieval men didn't wear trousers. They wore two separate wool tubes, one for each leg, that had to be laced directly into the hem of the pourpoint using dozens of leather ties called points. When you tied those points tightly, the jacket and the pants essentially became one locked structural unit. Joan didn't wear this just to look like a soldier. She wore it as an anti-assault mechanism. When she was captured by the English and thrown into a military prison guarded entirely by hostile men, those dozens of complex, tightly knotted leather laces were her only defense. It took immense time and effort to unlace a pourpoint. As long as she stayed in men's clothes, she was physically locked into her garments. The court didn't burn Joan of Arc because she heard the voice of God. They burned her on the specific, documented charge of cross-dressing. They ordered her to put on a woman's dress. She knew exactly what would happen to her in that cell if she wore a loose skirt. She refused. She chose the fire over the dress. Let's rank the pourpoint on a woman. Comfort? It's a rigid, padded combat jacket. Practicality? It served as literal life-saving armor against the worst of humanity. Style? It is the most profound, defiant, and tragic sartorial choice in European history. The pourpoint breaks the scale. It transcends S tier. It is the God tier of the forbidden list. It proves that in the Middle Ages, clothing wasn't just fabric. It was a lock. It was a weapon. It was the boundary line between life and death. But you can't look at the tragedy of the pourpoint without looking at the absolute filth of the streets that Joan walked on. We've talked about the high-fashion chopines of Venice. But what did the average woman wear when it rained? You couldn't just ruin your only pair of leather turn shoes in the medieval mud. The streets were open sewers. Animal waste, butchery runoff, and stagnant water were everywhere. You needed the patten. Pattens weren't shoes. They were wooden platforms with leather straps that you slid your actual shoes into before stepping outside. They had thick wooden blocks underneath them, elevating your foot 2 or 3 inches above the grime. When you walked, the wood smacked against the cobblestones, creating a loud, rhythmic clack, clack, clack that echoed through every medieval city. They were the medieval equivalent of wearing Crocs over your sneakers. Were they elegant? No. Did they look ridiculous? Absolutely. But without them, your leather shoes would rot off your feet in a month, and your God-tier kirtle would be permanently stained with horse manure. Comfort? You are clomping around on wooden blocks. Practicality? 10 out of 10. It's environmental shielding. Style? Complete 0. You look like you have furniture attached to your feet. The pattern goes straight into B tier. It's ugly, but it's the only reason anyone survived walking to the bakery in November. And surviving the elements brings us to the final item on the forbidden tier. The one garment that every single movie gets wrong, because we are so obsessed with modern aesthetics that we project them backwards. Let's rank the bridal gown. Close your eyes and picture a medieval wedding. You are probably picturing a beautiful white dress, maybe some lace, a delicate veil. Wipe that entirely from your brain. White wedding dresses didn't exist. In fact, in 15th century France, white was the color of royal mourning. If you wore white to your wedding, you were essentially hosting a funeral. Medieval brides wore blue, or red, or green, or whatever the absolute most expensive piece of fabric they or their village could afford was. But the real flex of the medieval bride wasn't the dress. It was the hair. We already established that married women had to hide their hair under wimples and veils. Your wedding day was the absolute last time in your entire adult life that you were legally and socially permitted to let your hair down in public. Brides would literally walk down the aisle with their hair unbound, cascading all the way down their backs, crowned with a heavy wreath of woven gold wire, fresh flowers, and pearls. It was a fleeting, spectacular display of youth and availability, right before the veil came down forever. It was a Cinderella moment with a ticking clock. The moment the priest finished the vows, the hair was braided up, the linen was pinned on, and the bride transitioned from a maiden to a manager. Comfort? It's the best dress you own. Practicality? You can wear it again because it isn't white. Style? It is the purest visual representation of a major life transition. The medieval wedding gown lands securely in S tier. It wasn't about virginity or purity. It was about the economics of transferring a woman from one household to another in the highest definition color possible. So look at the true, unfiltered board. We have the Zibellino, rotting in C tier, a useless flex against the plague. We have the Patons and the Clout, holding down B tier, the unglamorous champions of daily survival. We have the widow's barb in A tier, the stark white shield of financial independence. We have the fitchet and the bridal gown in S tier, the masterpieces of practical design and social signaling. And towering above them all, we have the pourpoint, the men's jacket that became a woman's fortress. You came into this looking for princesses and peasant rags, but what you found was a fiercely intelligent, highly adaptive population of women who used every single thread at their disposal to manipulate the world around them. They hid their money in secret slits. They weaponized taxidermy. They used transparent silk to mock the church to its face. And when the walls closed in, they tied their laces tight and refused to surrender. We have moved from the skin to the silhouette, from the humble linen chemise to the gold-encrusted weight of the houppelande, and from the mud-caked patins of the street to the gravity-defying peaks of the hennin. We have looked at the windows to hell and realized they weren't just scandalous cutouts, they were declarations of autonomy. We have looked at the princess hat and seen not a fairy tale trope, but an engineering marvel born of spite and status. So, what is the ultimate truth of the medieval wardrobe? What is the one answer that ties this entire millennium together? The core revelation is this: medieval fashion was never about being pretty. It was about being legible. In a world without social media, without digital IDs, and without mass-produced consumer goods, your body was the only billboard you owned. Every button on your sleeve, every inch of your shoe's point, and every transparent thread of your veil was a word in a sentence that told the world exactly who you were, and more importantly, who you refused to be. When we look at our S tier, we see a pattern. The cote-hardie, the false sleeves, the horned headdress, and the kirtle weren't just clothes. They were tools of resistance. They were the ways women navigated a world that was constantly trying to pin them down, hide them away, or define them by their relationship to men. The woman in the windows to hell surcoat wasn't an accidental sinner. She was a woman who looked at the most powerful institution on earth, the church, and decided that her right to be seen as wealthy and powerful was more important than their threats of damnation. The woman in the 20-inch Chopins wasn't a victim of vanity. She was a woman so secure in her status that she could force the world to literally support her weight. The woman in the spiral-laced kirtle wasn't oppressed by her dress. She was supported by a masterpiece of engineering that gave her the physical freedom to run an estate, brew beer, and survive a plague. We have dismantled the Hollywood lie of the dirty Middle Ages. We have burned the costume department's myths to the ground. In their place, we have found a world of vibrant, toxic, brilliant color. We have found women who bleached their hair with lye and painted their faces with lead, not out of a lack of intelligence, but out of a desperate human drive to achieve an ideal. We have found a society that was obsessed with the Gothic slouch, not because they were lazy, but because they valued the appearance of abundance in a time of scarcity. This brings us back to the question I asked at the very beginning. If you were transported back to the year 1350 right now, would you be dressed for a coronation or a catastrophe? The answer doesn't depend on whether you're wearing silk or wool. It depends on whether you understand the rules of the game. Medieval fashion teaches us that the human spirit is fundamentally unquenchable. You can pass sumptuary laws to stop people from wearing purple, and they will just find a more expensive shade of red. You can tell women to cover their hair, and they will weave that hair into golden horns. You can tell them to be modest, and they will cut holes in their dresses to show off the silk underneath. The S tier of this entire list isn't a specific garment. It is the ingenuity of the wearer. The Middle Ages wasn't a drab, brown landscape of potato sacks. It was a high-stakes battlefield of velvet and silk where the stakes were nothing less than your social survival. Every time a medieval woman pinned her veil or laced her kirtle, she was engaging in an act of creation. She was building a version of herself that the world could not ignore. When you look at the final board, don't just see a collection of old clothes. See a map of human ambition. See the God-tier resilience of Joan of Arc in her locked hose. See the S-tier defiance of the merchant's wife in her transparent veil. See the A-tier brilliance of the peasant woman in her St. Birgitta cap, working the fields to feed a continent. We have spent 1,000 years pretending these people were different from us, that they were simpler, dirtier, or less vain. But the reality is that we are still wearing their legacy. When you put on a fitted jacket, you are wearing the ghost of the cotehardie. When you wear a statement hat, you are channeling the energy of the hennin. When you value a brand name, you are following the same logic as the knight with his heraldic tabard. The Middle Ages never truly ended. It just changed its tailoring. The windows to hell are still open. We are still choosing what to reveal and what to hide. We are still using fashion to signal our tribe, our wealth, and our rebellion. And while we might not be using mercury to dye our clothes or lye to bleach our hair, the drive to stand out, to be seen, and to be powerful remains exactly the same. The ultimate victory of medieval fashion is that 1,000 years later, we are still talking about it. We are still mesmerized by the height of their hats and the length of their trains. We are still trying to decode the secret language of their sleeves. They weren't just dressing for a season. They were dressing for history. And as we look at this completed tier list, it's clear that they didn't just survive the scrutiny of the archives, they conquered them. They took the limited resources of a pre-industrial world and turned them into a symphony of status and style. So, as we close the wardrobe doors on this millennium of fashion, remember the women who stood in the freezing stone halls of the 14th century. Remember the weight of the gold, the sting of the lye, and the click of the wooden pattens on the cobblestones. They weren't just princesses in towers. They were the masters of their own image, the engineers of their own bodies, and the undisputed queens of the most scandalous, vibrant, and brilliant era of fashion the world has ever seen. The ranking is complete, the myths are busted, and the god tier remains exactly where it belongs, in the hands of the women who dared to wear the impossible. The Middle Ages didn't just have style, they invented the very concept of looking hot as a form of social warfare. And 1,000 years later, the windows to hell are still the best view in the house. When we step back from this board, we aren't just looking at a collection of old clothes. We are looking at a map of human ambition and the definitive proof that the Middle Ages were anything but drab. We've closed the loop on why the 14th century remains the undisputed peak of human aesthetics. It was the brief, golden moment where tailoring met artistry, giving us the S-tier coat-hardy and the technical perfection of the spiral-laced kirtle. We've seen exactly why the 15th century went absolutely off the rails with its footwear and headgear, as the survivors of the Black Death used every spare yard of velvet to scream their status to a world that had almost ended. The windows to hell weren't just scandalous cutouts. They were the visual manifestation of women reclaiming their bodies and their agency from the pulpit. The princess hat wasn't a fairy tale prop. It was a high-stakes architectural flex that demanded a level of poise we can barely imagine today. By burning the peasant rag myth to the ground, we've revealed a world of vibrant dyes, strategic legal loopholes, and a population of women who were the ultimate engineers of their own identity. The most satisfying answer to the mystery of medieval fashion is that it was never about looking pretty. It was about being undeniable. Whether it was the god-tier resilience of a woman in her locked hose or the S-tier defiance of a merchant's wife in her transparent veil, these garments were weapons of social warfare. They prove that even in a world of rigid hierarchies and constant plague, the human drive to be seen, to be powerful, and to be absolutely fabulous is unquenchable. You didn't just wear a houppelande or a wimple. You wore your bank statement, your bloodline, and your defiance to anyone who told you to stay in your place. If you were transported back to 1350 right now, you wouldn't find a monolith of grime. You'd find a high-stakes battlefield of silk and wool where every pin and every pleat was a conscious choice. The Middle Ages didn't just have style. They invented the very concept of the fashion icon. And looking at this final ranking, it's clear. They didn't just survive the scrutiny of history, they conquered it. The S-tier isn't just the clothes on the board. It's the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the women who dared to wear them. They took the limited resources of a pre-industrial world and turned them into a symphony of status that still echoes in every red carpet and runway today. The windows to hell are still open, and as it turns out, the view is spectacular. We have traveled from the linen barrier of the chemise to the gold-weighted majesty of the houppelande, from the mud-caked practicality of the wooden paten to the gravity-defying arrogance of the 3-foot hennin. We have dissected the windows to hell, peered into the secret support of the Lengberg breast bags, and felt the literal weight of a society that traded in velvet as if it were hard currency. But as we stand before this completed tier list, we have to ask the most important question of all. What does any of this actually tell us about the human beings who lived, breathed, and bled inside these garments? The ultimate lesson of the medieval wardrobe is that fashion has never, ever been about looking pretty. That is a modern, sanitized lie we tell ourselves to feel superior to the past. In the Middle Ages, fashion was a high-stakes, high-definition language of legibility. In a world without digital footprints, Your body was the only billboard you owned. Every button on your sleeve was a word. Every inch of your shoe's point was a sentence, and the specific shade of your veil was a manifesto. When you walked into a room, you weren't just showing off. You were broadcasting your bank statement, your bloodline, your political alliances, and your moral compass in a language that every person from the king to the stable boy could read perfectly. What we've truly ranked today isn't just a collection of old clothes. It's a 1,000-year-old battlefield of agency. We've been taught to see the Middle Ages as a monolith of oppression, a dark age where women were merely passive victims of a dour, colorless church. But the evidence on this board screams the opposite. The S tier isn't populated by garments of submission. It is filled with masterpieces of malicious compliance. Think about the woman in the transparent silk crisp veil. She was told by the most powerful institution on earth to cover her hair. She didn't hide. She innovated. She found a loophole made of whisper-thin thread that allowed her to follow the letter of the law while completely violating its spirit, framing her beauty in a literal halo of gold-wired rebellion. Think about the woman in the 20-inch Venetian Chopins. She wasn't a victim of vanity. She was a woman so secure in her social power that she could force the architecture of the city to adapt to her height, requiring a retinue of servants just to support her walk. She wasn't being restricted. She was being exalted. The S tier of this entire millennium isn't a specific dress or a certain hat. It is the unquenchable ingenuity of the wearer. We see it in the working-class woman who engineered the Saint Brigida cap to survive the dust of the harvest, and we see it in Joan of Arc, who used the complex lacing of men's hose as a physical fortress against the worst of humanity. These women weren't waiting for the Renaissance to turn the lights on. They were living in a world of eye-searing vermilion, toxic emerald greens, and shimmering cloth of gold. They were the architects of their own aesthetic, fighting a daily war against gravity, chemistry, and sumptuary laws to ensure they were never, ever invisible. This realization should change the way you look at every stone castle and every illuminated manuscript. The Middle Ages wasn't a drab landscape of potato sacks and grime. It was a riot of color and a triumph of engineering. They didn't have sewing machines, but they had the bias cut and the spiral lace. They didn't have modern polymers, but they had the sheer audacity to wear lead-based paint and mercury-dyed silk just to prove they were the most influential person in the room. They were just as vain, just as creative, and just as daring as we are, perhaps even more so, because their fashion choices could literally get them excommunicated or imprisoned. The God-tier items on our list, the kirtle, the cote-hardy, the pourpoint, survive in our cultural memory because they represent the moment human beings figured out how to sculpt the body through fabric. They represent the transition from clothes that merely covered us to clothes that defined us. We are still wearing their legacy today. Every time you wear a tailored jacket, you are channeling the cote-hardy. Every time you wear statement headwear, you are echoing the hennin. Every time you value a brand logo, you are following the logic of the heraldic tabard. The Middle Ages never truly ended. It just changed its tools. We are still using our bodies to navigate the same hierarchies, to signal our tribes, and to mock the authorities who try to tell us what is modest or appropriate. We are still looking for those windows to hell, those places where we can show a little bit of who we really are through the gaps in the rules. So, let the final image of this journey not be a princess in a tower, but a woman standing in the center of a crowded 14th century marketplace. She is balanced on wooden stilts. Her skin is glowing with toxic white lead. Her hair is bleached golden by the sun and lye, and she is sewn so tightly into her silk sleeves that she cannot even bend her arms to pick up a coin. She is a terrifying, highly engineered, beautiful masterpiece of her own making. She is a survivor of famine, plague, and war, and she is standing there, demanding that you look at her. She isn't a relic of a dark age. She is the ancestor of every person who has ever used a stitch of clothing to say, "I am here, I am powerful, and I will not be ignored." The ranking is final, the myths are burned, and the windows to hell are wide open. In the end, the Middle Ages didn't just give us fashion, they gave us the power of the image. And 1,000 years later, the view is still absolutely spectacular. We have spent this time peeling back the layers of lead paint, velvet, and historical malpractice to find the truth hidden beneath the floorboards of Lengberg Castle and the margins of illuminated manuscripts. The board is finalized, but the investigation into the true Dark Ages is far from over. If you found yourself looking at that S tier and realizing that the medieval world was far more vibrant, engineered, and rebellious than any blockbuster film ever dared to show, then you have already taken the first step toward reclaiming history from the myths that have obscured it for centuries. We didn't just rank clothes today. We reconstructed a lost language. We've proven that the windows to hell weren't just scandalous slits in a dress chungla, nung ban tuyen ngon vesutu chukwa funu. We've seen that a simple linen cap was the backbone of an empire's economy, and that a men's combat jacket could be a woman's ultimate fortress. This is the level of detail we demand on this channel, because history is not a monolith of drab tunics and grime. It is a high-stakes battlefield of human ingenuity. If you are the kind of person who refuses to settle for the potato sack version of the past, if you want to be in the room when we dismantle the next great historical lie, then you need to ensure you are part of this archive. We are building a community of skeptics, researchers, and enthusiasts who know that the most interesting parts of history are the ones the church tried to hide, or the movies were too lazy to build. By joining us, you aren't just clicking a button, you are marking your place in a movement that values the complexity of the human spirit over the simplicity of a fairy tale. We have so many more wardrobes to raid, more myths to burn, and more S-tier truths to uncover. Make sure you don't miss the next time we pull back the veil. But understanding the clothes is only the beginning of the story. We've spent a lot of time talking about the hygiene hero that was the linen chemise and the toxic reality of mercury-based dyes. This leads us to the single biggest question that haunts every discussion of the Middle Ages. If they were this obsessed with their appearance, their fabrics, and their social legibility, how did they actually live? We've dismantled the myth of the dirty peasant dress, but what about the dirty peasant body? If you were shocked by the breast bags of 1450 or the lead paint foundation of the Venetian courts, you are completely unprepared for the reality of how these people managed their physical selves. The history of medieval hygiene is just as scandalous, just as engineered, and just as misunderstood as their fashion. We've prepared a deep dive that takes everything you just learned about the windows to hell and applies it to the bathhouse, the bedroom, and the doctor's office. Click the video on your screen right now to see the dirty truth about medieval hygiene. We're going to look at the real science of the sweat-wicking chemise, the bizarre reality of medieval dentistry, and why the smelly Middle Ages is the second biggest lie ever told about our ancestors. The board is moving from the wardrobe to the wash basin, and the answers are going to change the way you see the human body forever. I'll see you over there.